Hello, I'm Karina Lesser, Artistic Director of Scripps Presents, and I'm delighted to welcome you to a conversation with Rebecca Solnit about her terrific new book, Orwell's Roses. Scripps Presents seeks to complement the dynamic humanities curriculum at the college by bringing the most thoughtful and timely writers, artists, and scholars into conversation with our community. Our series is also an opportunity to partner with fantastic places like Skylight Books, one of the best neighborhood indie bookstores around. You'll be hearing more about its upcoming program offerings from Skylight's own Maddie Gobo at the conclusion of this program. And now on to tonight's guests. Rebecca Solnit is the author of more than 20 books, including the memoir Recollections of My Non-Existence and the nonfiction A Field Guide to Getting Lost, The Faraway Nearby, A Paradise Built in Hell, River of Shadows, and Wanderlust. She is also the author of Men Explain Things to Me and many essays on feminism, activism, and social change, hope, and the climate crisis. She's here to discuss her latest book, of which the Los Angeles Times writes, Orwell's Roses is, from its beautiful cover to its impassioned coda, one of Solnit's very best. A multifaceted tribute, at once a biographical study of this champion of freedom, an impressive work of cultural and literary criticism, and now a testament to Solnit's far-ranging curiosity. She leaves no row unhoed as she simultaneously explores the roots of Orwell's prolific literary output and the fecund history of roses. A triumph, a delight of digressions. Tonight, she'll be in conversation with the National Book Critics Circle and Kingsley Tufts Poetry Award winner, Ross Gay. A quick housekeeping note, if you have a question for Rebecca, please put it in the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen, and we'll do our very best to get to it. And now, Rebecca and Ross, welcome to the Scripps Presents virtual stage. We're so honored to have you here.
Thank you so much. I am so thrilled to be here with Ross Gay, who has lots of books, some of which are on my mantelpiece. And let me see, I think you're supposed to interview me or something, but I'm happy to just have a broader conversation about dirt and manure and gardens.
Yes, I'm so excited.
Fascism and flowers and all the rest.
Also, I just want to say just at the outset, like with it, it feels so lucky to get to be in conversation with you because you are like, you are actually one of the people who I think of as my teachers. And one of the people who I think of as like, yes, who have shown me how to write, how to think. And I'll have questions about this as a, writing questions in a way. But like books like A Field Guide to Getting Lost have been guides for me and also for so many people in my circle for so long, and The Faraway Nearby and, Paradise Built in Hell, like so many of these books have meant so much to us and to me specifically. So I just want to say that first, like a kind of note of gratitude to start.
Well, thank you. I read a lot of climate scientists' Twitter feeds and scientifics and newspaper stuff and really deadly stuff that kind of destroys my prose style. So I always go back to poetry, including yours, to kind of remind me what language can do. And one of the funny things with this book is it keeps getting called a collection of essays, because I think people who totally understand that you can do this in poetry don't quite get that you can do it in prose as well. That kind of leaps and, something in which all the parts are utterly integrated and belong together, but it's not a linear structure. It's rhizomatic. It's, associative. So
yeah,
exciting. I think you might be the only poet per se I'm with on this book tour. So to quote the third grader when my friend Aaron Shuren walked into the classroom, yay, poetry.
that might be a nice, maybe the first thing to say is like, just to like let people who haven't read the book yet, which is amazing and just like such a beautiful, astonishing book, a kind of lyric biography that I learned so much about Orwell. Orwell is actually someone who I had not read a lot of. And so I learned a lot of biographical information, but also got turned on to things about him that I otherwise would not have known. But that's, I guess in one way, maybe the first question would be why Orwell, how the book came to pass.
Flowers actually started it, but I was looking for fruit trees and found roses. One of my closest friends, the documentary filmmaker Sam Green, vaguely thinks he might someday do a project about trees, and we both love trees for all kinds of emotional and intellectual and ecological and aesthetic reasons. And we would send stuff back and forth he lives in Brooklyn. And then finally we're hanging out in the summer of 2017. We went to see Mary Ellen Pleasant's eucalyptus trees, these trees planted by a woman who'd been part of the Underground Railroad and a former slave herself, integrated the streetcars in San Francisco. And it's like so long gone, but her trees you can stand under, and they'll whisper among you, "I'll mail you some eucalyptus leaves." And but so we're talking about trees and people who planted trees, which is why we visited Mary Ellen Pleasant's. And they said, well, Orwell planted fruit trees, because there's this essay of his I had always loved, but always thought it was like a trace of who Orwell might have been if he hadn't lived in a time of war and strife and fascism and totalitarianism and et cetera, and been busy with other things. And so I pulled up the essay, and then I figured out where he lived, and then we did Google Earth, and you can't really tell what species of tree you're looking at from Google Earth. They all look like kind of green blobs. And so then later that year, I was traveling from London to Cambridge on book tour, and got off at the train station Baldock and got a taxi to the cottage. And I really thought I was just going to peer over the fence or have someone slam a door in my face and then kind of peer over the garden gate or something to see if there are any fruit trees that look, things that looked like 80-year-old Cox's orange pippin apples and things. And it was such a great rural experience. The taxi driver, first of all, knew exactly where I was going. And then he sees a Graham Lamb, who's one of the two people who lives there. He lives there with his partner, Don Spaniel. And he said, "Oh, there's Graham. I'll just introduce you now," which I was not expecting. Sam had written to him about the trees, and he was very apologetic about not replying, but invited me in. And it eventually turned out the trees had been cut down in the 90s. And then very casually, after a cup of tea and meeting Nigel next door, who remembered the fruit trees, so that at least I met somebody who had witnessed Orwell's trees, they said, "Oh, but his roses are still growing. Would you like to see them?" And that kind of blew me away. And I knew the essay in which he says that he'd planted roses. And I'd known that essay, for almost 40 years. But at that moment, I realized I'd never thought hard enough. What does it mean that this particular person planted roses? That, we think Orwell is usually presented as this very manly, stern, austere, pessimistic, grim, grayish figure. And you can plant fruit trees for purely socialist reasons. They produce something utilitarian reasons. They produce food. Of course, they produce, and you write about this so beautifully, so much more than that: pleasure and beauty and habitat for wildlife, from insects to, squirrels and birds and stuff. But I just thought, what does it mean that this particular person planted roses? Because you can only plant roses for pleasure and beauty and joy. And this book is essentially seven versions of an incomplete answer to that question in 7 sections. It's just an invitation to explore Orwell, but I keep saying the roses are a portal of entry for Orwell, but Orwell's a portal of entry for thinking about roses, about plants. And I also, in this age of climate crisis, I wanted to write a book in which plants were active agents and not kind of passive, and in which we thought about climate change and the rest. And now I'm really digressing, but I do that.
Oh, I love that. And that thing of one question I have, I was sort of thinking about this, is that Orwell, in this I learned actually one of the books that I used to teach Why I Write, and when I was teaching composition, or what politics in the English language, maybe it was that one I was teaching.
Is it Why I Write, where he talks about anyone who cares to examine my work will see that even when it is downright propaganda, it contains much that a full-time politician would consider irrelevant? Right.
Right.
I have my cliff notes spread out around me.
It's so good. It's so beautiful. But it's like there is this kind of tension even in Orwell, where I have a couple questions about the later work where he was writing these what feel like these sort of short essays that were almost purely about sort of, I can't remember exactly how you put it, but small things in a way, not the sort of political things that he was writing about. But go ahead.
Kind of like the book, or Orwell's Book of Delights.
Well, that's what I was like. I was like, really? And so I'm excited to read that, but I was sort of thinking about what does it mean for Orwell to be someone who had such a kind of beef with like certain, whatever the language, what he calls like purple Latin, the Latin language and all that stuff,
Yeah.
but to also sort of like be really committed to this life of, this life of beauty, as you bring so much attention to. You really help us to understand that Orwell was not just sort of, this is crucial, and we'll talk about this, but it was not just railing against things. He was also sort of laboring in the effort of beauty. And I guess one of the things I'm kind of like, it just makes me think, I'm curious about the tension between that, that Orwell thing about language, wanting to avoid in a way what is purple. But then roses are, I know a lot of functions for roses, but in a way, if you're not thinking of them in the socialist way, say, that you can get good, board feet out of the tree, So anyway, maybe you could just talk around that a little bit.
Yeah. And, and he talks about the purple passages, which I think is, that when he lacked a political purpose is when he had these purple passages, which he disdains. And I think it's partly he's in the era of Gertrude Stein and Ernest Hemingway, and this idea of a cleaned up, pared down language, and as kind of better writing. So I think that's sort of there. And of course, they're coming out of the Victorian age where you have the Bulwer-Lytton people who really overwrite everything, this kind of prolix, verbose, too many adjectives, too many adverbs, too many long, bulky sentences. So I think that people of his era really wanted to streamline, but you can still, he wasn't Hemingway. He didn't give up his adjectives and adverbs and complex sentence structures. And, but I think also he thought of the purple as where you're being kind of florid or decorative when it doesn't really suit the subject, that in a sense the beauty comes in other ways. And it's interesting because one of the questions for me is, well, what is Orwell's sense of beauty? And he's crazy about flowers and keeps planting them over and over all the way until his death, and putting a lot of energy into planting gardens, partly food gardens, but also always flowers too. But he's also interested, I think, and this was really rewarding for me to work through, in refusing to let ethics and aesthetics be separate and finding a kind of moral beauty in truth, generosity, friendship. And so I think the beauty he looks for in language, first of all, is that it be honest and truthful. And he describes two ways language is corroded. And in the politics in the English language, he talks about people who, when they're pushing something utterly corrupt, when they're lying, when they're deceiving, when they're covering up atrocities, they tend to get really verbose and use big Latinate words, the kind of the language of avoiding the point of not telling the truth. And then, of course, in Big Brother's world in 1984, the opposite is happening. They're trying to pare down language, to lose vocabulary words, lose meanings, to go from English as we know it to Newspeak, with the idea that you can make a language in which it's impossible to think certain ideas. For example, that free will no longer mean liberty and independence and self-jurisdiction. It will just mean free from, as in this dog is free from fleas. And so what happens if you don't have a word for being free? So he's he's very conscious of the potential uglinesses of language. And I think is always trying to do the opposite, which is the beauty of telling the truth as you see it, which might be incomplete, which might be subjective. In Homage to Catalonia, he's very clear. He didn't see everything in the Spanish Civil War. He's writing it after some things haven't been resolved, but at least he can be honest about what he knows and what he saw. So I think that there's a sense, and writing the book, I learned that essentially to describe his sense of language, that language is contracts in a sense, and lies are bogus contracts or cheats and things. So the first thing he wants language to do is to be an honest contract, which doesn't mean that language has to be simple or you have to know everything, but at least that you're not trying to deceive, you're trying to connect and not disconnect. And so that's part of his aesthetics. And then he's also very, what was also fun is that he takes so much pleasure, some of it aesthetic, some of it not, in nursery rhymes, fairy tales, body postcards, gardens, plants, the natural world, birds, a good cup of tea, English cookery, the seasons, an ideal pub, etc. He just takes a lot of pleasure. And that was what really shocked me, because I'd read a lot of Orwell. He'd been a big influence on me. I knew the writing, but I didn't know the person. And I grew up on the left, and now I'm like going on for a while, but I want to put this out there because I think it's really important. A lot of why I wrote about Orwell is that I grew up in and around the left, and there's often this sense in the left that to be really committed is to be austere, to be joyless, that often people exhibit their overwork and their grimness as kind of badges of virtue, whether or not they're getting anything done, whether or not they're making everyone around them fucking miserable. And I had this wonderful conversation a few days ago with Adrienne Marie Brown, who of course is author of Pleasure Politics. I think there's a strain coming from people of color, queer people, women, etc., not only the personalist, political, and the beloved community, that there's a lot of political joy in other arenas, but still there's this kind of masculine austerity. And it felt like George Orwell is kind of the ultimate figure. Nobody can say George Orwell is a lightweight. Nobody can say he's not committed. Nobody can say that he was just, that he was a slacker. So it felt like if George Orwell got his heroic work done while dying of tuberculosis, partly by watching birds and enjoying his chickens and loving his goats and planting his flowers, then we're all off the hook. Then he's kind of justified it for all of us. And then another part of it, and this feels like something I would kind of love to hear you talk about, because you're such a passionate gardener and a great writer. I also feel like in all of our lives, there are things we need to do that from outside, particularly with those Puritans and leftists telling us to be sort of like, crank out product and do nothing but the revolution. There's often a sense that the other things we do are trivial, irrelevant, self-indulgent, bourgeois. Somebody wrote in that flowers are bourgeois to him. But in
Tell
fact,
the bees that. Tell that to the bees.
Yeah, well, every fucking thing you eat had something to do with a flower, except maybe fish, seaweed, and mushrooms. But so I felt like also I'm really interested in what are the things we need to do to be sustainable so we can do our human rights work or our climate work or just hard work being a frontline worker in education or healthcare or a sanitation worker or something. What are those other things that keep us going? And can we value them? Because we all have really serious work we need to do, and we all need to figure out how to keep going. And so Orwell kind of is such a great case study for this.
Yeah, and it feels like it when you say that, it makes me think, I wonder if his biography has been curated in a way to sort of, excising the joyfulness out of it, curating this thing, which is this kind of, he's like never lightweight. He's always, this is what it means to be serious. Whereas,
exactly.
Whereas we know from all the people who have lived before us, and got us here, that actually part of being serious is like studying what you love and being able to articulate what you love,
There's also a sense I have as being like something of an activist for the last 30-something years that you can't do it full time. You have to, there's a sense I've seen with some people who've just discovered that there's racism or climate chaos or just found out that I've seen white kids who just found out indigenous lands were stolen and there was genocide, who throw themselves in it and think like at some level, I think they think, I'm going to give myself over to this and fix this problem, and then I'm going to go back to normal life. And it's kind of like, we're not going to run out of problems. So you better figure out a way to be, committed to justice, committed to, the environment, committed to your community for the rest of your life. And that means there are going to be emergencies and sort of every shoulder to the wheel moments. but it's not going to go away just because you make yourself miserable. I also think there's a huge confusion on the part of the austere side of activists and the left that hard work is an end in itself, austerity is an end in itself, that somehow you're becoming the perfect revolutionary, the perfect leftist, the perfect activist, whether or not you're getting anything done. And I think two things often happen there, one of which is you make yourself miserable and then everyone else around you. And the other is if you obsess about what you're opposed to and forget about what you're for, you can get very lost in many spiritual, psychological, and practical political ways, and that happens all the time. And so to see Orwell like being one of our great anti-fascists, one of our great voices against totalitarianism, while a lot of the left was very soft on Stalinism, but just making that time over and over to go back to his garden and his pleasures is just remarkable. And it feels like it gives us all permission. And that's kind of one of the things I wanted to do with this book. Obviously, you don't need any permission because you are gardening on the grand scale. I was reading the title poem and catalog of unabashed gratitude, where you say, I have shoveled tons of shit. No, I mean that literally, tons. And
Yeah.
Orwell would have liked you quite a lot.
Yeah, well, God, that feels like such an important that moment, actually I have it open. One of the moments where you say this: the left has never been short on people arguing that it is callous and immoral to enjoy oneself while others suffer. And somewhere others will always be suffering. It's a puritanical position, implying that what one has to offer them is one's own austerity or joylessness, rather than some practical contribution toward their liberation.
I took out a snarkier sentence that followed. It said, like, people in gulags and death camps and in the middle of genocides are probably not cheered by the idea that somewhere in America, a very safe person with means is sitting on the couch sulking.
Yes, totally, exactly. And it is,
Yeah.
I mean, that like when you talk about the sort of, the spiritual hurt or the psychic hurt that is the result of, this verb that I've been thinking about. I don't know where I got it, but againsting, when you're againsting, that's your thing, which can be, like when we're trying to fix stuff, it's like againsting. I'm against this, I'm against that. But this book, I mean, and I think your work is so much, it has been a guide for me that way. But when you're only againsting, you lose track, like you say. But the struggle, I think, and the struggle that we, this book sort of points out, but that we're indebted to each other for, is to hang on to what it is that we want, hang on to what it is that we want, and studying that and sort of, elevating that,
Yeah. And, it's something I've been thinking about with the climate movement. There was a long period, because I've been trying to do climate work for at least 15 years and following around people who are doing it better, like Bill McKibben. It felt for a long time we're trying to make the case that no, it's urgent. No, we're really in danger. No, there's a lot of chaos being unleashed around us. A lot of, the ocean is acidifying, the glaciers are melting, the correlation between when flowers bloom and insects hatch or birds migrate is getting all screwed up. And now I'm beginning to feel like, people under 30 something have never lived a month of below average temperatures. We've had 30 something years where every month has been above average for the longer record. That what we actually need to do is to also remember just how beautiful the world is, how beautifully orchestrated and complex these systems are, and to cherish them and to praise them. Because essentially what we're doing as climate people is trying to protect the beauty. Beauty might not be the most important way to describe it. It's also systems of survival, but they are beautiful. And to describe that and recognize that, and also to remember that come what may, we can choose the best case scenario for climate change. And that's in the works this week in terrifying ways, between the Build Back Better budget reconciliation process and the Glasgow Climate Summit starting next week. But, but the sun will still set. Okay, I'm a Pacific person. The sun will still set over the ocean. Sorry, Atlantic. Well, we're with Scripps. I know it doesn't happen quite that way in Indiana, but that dawn and dusk and stars and light and weather and rain and clouds, and there will be grass, there will be birds, there will be trees, there will be they might not be doing the same things in the same places. So it feels like some of the crisis people are having is looking at the ugliness of what's being done and fearing that they're going to live, particularly the young people who know they have 60 or 80 years ahead of them, that they're going to live in a world in which in some sense beauty has been wiped out, as well as the kind of security that goes with living on a stable planet. So I think about that a lot, that we need to celebrate and make visible and hold up that the world is beautiful now and it will remain beautiful, and we're defending beauty. Yeah. And that feels very connected to what I was trying to do here.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And it felt so important that you're sort of again and again saying that Orwell was really, one of the things that Orwell was doing was defending beauty. And even I think in those sentences where he's like, dogging purple prose or whatever, his sentences are beautiful. They're always, he writes really beautiful sentences,
He is a beautiful writer, and it is this very, it's a very clean, brisk style, but it's not simplistic. I think there's a kind of Hemingway-esque thing, which I've always thought is some kind of idea of masculinity in language, which is endlessly tedious and repressive and repressed. But he has this, I'm going to read a little bit more from this credo statement in Why I Write. So, I am not able and do not want completely to abandon the worldview that I acquired in childhood. So long as I remain alive and well, I shall continue to feel strongly about prose style, to love the surface of the earth, and to take a pleasure in solid objects and scraps of useless information. And I love that sentence. It's so positive and it's so active with those active verbs. And it's also deeply eclectic to describe love of nature as the surface of the earth, and then there's solid objects and scraps of useless information. It's such a great list too of what he cares about and how that's going to be present in his language. So and I think part of what he's doing is saying we all have really important work to do as anti-fascists and, et cetera. But it doesn't mean you have to stop this other stuff. One of the things that I didn't know before that was so meaningful for me with this book was the origins of the phrase bread and roses. And until I knew its origin, I didn't really understand what it meant. And of course, it's coined by Helen Todd with the help of a woman farm worker, farmhand in 1910 to mean, and, Helen Todd is a women's suffrage activist trying to get the vote for women when it's being won state by state. And actually, Illinois got voting early, and there were Black women organizing voting coalitions in Chicago long before the 19th Amendment, but I digress, which I do. But, so she's campaigning for the vote, and it's very tied to the labor struggle. The idea is you give women the vote, and we're going to vote for economic justice and bring about a better world. But the great phrase is we fight for bread, but roses too, insisting, unlike a lot of socialists and leftists and labor movements, we don't just want the basic necessities, which bread stands for, but we want beauty, we want culture, we want nature, we want leisure, we want art. We want, and it's staking out this really big, wide open demand that everyone should have roses too. And I love it because also roses are subjective. What I want to do, what I find beautiful, what I want to do with my spare time, what inspires and brings joy to me is going to be different than you. Sometimes you get totalitarian states where the trains run on time and they feed their people pretty well. But they'll kind of mandate what the roses are supposed to be. You can have this culture, you can read this poet, but not this poet. You can think about this, but not that. You can go here, but not there. And so Bread and Roses is also an argument for things Orwell was passionate about: privacy, independence, freedom. which will to some extent be used just to go pursue, be used for political things, but also to go decide what exactly it is you want to do and not have it decided for you. So Bread and Roses has now become a way I think about a lot of things, and it's been really helpful to understand its origins. And, it's one of the digressions in this book.
So that was amazing to know that. I didn't know the origin of that phrase at all. I'd heard of the Bread and Roses puppet theater, I think the puppet theater.
Yeah. That's actually Bread and Puppets, but Bread and Roses, Mimi Farina, Joan Baez's sister, founded Bread and Roses to bring music to institutionalized people in prisons and hospitals and care homes and things like that. Founded it, I think, in the early 70s, and it's still going. Mm-hmm. So it's a phrase that's like 111 years old that's had this completely amazing way of kind of working through the culture and being used and to mean different things at different times.
Yeah. So you've said a few times, you've used the word digression, and that's another way that I think of you as like a kind of mentor, a writing mentor, is that that digression is just one of your modes of thinking. And I just had a chance to talk to you. I figured I wanted to ask you, like, one question is like, is there an ethics to digression? That's one question I have. And then I also kind of, you talk about the rhizome a little bit, rhizome stuff. You also, that last list of Orwell's that you read, I forget what it was, but it almost sounded like, oh, that's almost getting like that list of Orwell's. It sounds like, oh, he might be inclined to be, well, I think he is. What I've read of him, he is a little bit inclined to be digressive. But anyway, I just want to know almost how the digression as a mode of thinking and a mode of writing came to you, and do you think of it in terms of a kind of ethics, or do you think of it in other ways?
I do. I think we're in an era where the revolution is for us to truly deeply understand and live that everything is connected to everything else, that we live in interdependence, interconnection, and that's an ecological worldview with a lot of spiritual dimensions. And that often training, universities divide up into fields. And actually, when I wrote my book, Wanderlust, I said, if there's a history of walking, it trespasses against everybody else's field in the course of pursuing its, thinking of fields, making the metaphor literal of like little rectangles, maybe hedged or fenced around. But I think often to truly understand something, you have to understand it in relationship. And that relationship is not linear. We get very excited about linearity in this culture because it's efficient, it's streamlined, but it's often achieved in storytelling by pairing things off and by cutting things out, and I wrote a book about, when was it, 2012, called The Faraway Nearby, and I called it a memoir, anti-memoir, because I talked about some crises in my own life and my mother's decline or sort of journey through Alzheimer's. It wasn't all decline. And I told a lot of other stories about Mary Shelley, about a woman in the Arctic who was forced to turn to cannibalism, about Che Guevara's work with people with leprosy, because I felt like we are literally shaped and guided by the stories we tell. And rather than tell a linear story of this is what happened to me, I wanted to tell the stories that got me through, that helped me understand how to think about where I was, to think about what stories do. And so in a sense, it's an autobiography, it's a memoir telling other people's stories as much or more than my own. It's also structured as kind of a palindrome or mirror image. So the first and last chapters have the first names and stuff. So, but then it also feels like, how do we understand what it means that Orwell planted roses? You can't write a straight biography, because a straight biography packs in everything about Orwell, but only, and actually most of them, almost nothing about roses. You have to understand what roses mean. You have to understand what England means. You have to understand Orwell's descent from people who held slaves in the Caribbean and profited off teak in Burma, and his father, the Indian opium agent, these three ways in which the plant kingdom became part of a monstrous biocolonialism. You have to understand that Orwell himself is dying of the bacteria called tuberculosis all the way through. And I think kind of more alive for it, knowing that his time will run out, rather than like a lot of us who are good at wasting time and being miserable, that we have endless time to, and so I feel like there's a way, the shortest distance between 2 points is part of that efficiency, which I often see as my enemy. Efficiency, convenience, etc. That it's like the difference between the superhighway streamlined narrative and the kind of bushwhacking. I'm trying to write about it and describing going mushroom hunting, where, your route if you mushroom hunt looks like this. I went mushroom hunting with my great friend, Greg Powell, and at 10,000 feet in New Mexico. How do you find out how things are connected? You trace those connections, and that process is not linear. If you're trying to describe a spider web, a network, can you actually say, Mike O'Reilly, the underground fungi? I listened to Suzanne Simard's book, but this is one of those like, no, I cannot say that word out loud. The fungal networks that we now know connect trees together. And it's one of the things that science is reinforcing, that everything is connected, but we're also shifting towards stories in which we recognize that connection. So I feel like you can't tell a really linear story without leaving out everything I want to leave in. And so it's that. And I also have always loved a kind of storytelling. Garrison Keillor at his best used to do it, where it feels like somebody's meandering around and these things aren't quite connected. And then the last little piece falls into place, and it's like the keystone of the arch, or just something you've come back exactly where you started, and you suddenly see you walked a perfect circle and the narrator was never lost. So, I'm interested in those associations, and I find it's actually how we think and talk. And there's this deep artifice we learn in English comp and stuff of trying to throw out a lot of babies with the bathwater and think that there's only one baby in the story. Yeah. So all of that. There's a wonderful series of woodblock prints, the 36 Views of Mount Fuji by Hokusai. And in about 35 of them, Mount Fuji's that perfect little snow-capped cone everybody's seen a million times. But in one of them, the pilgrims are actually on the mountain and you can't see the mountain. I also learned, particularly from Walking Labyrinths for the book on walking, that to get to the center of a labyrinth, you turn away, you go around, you zigzag, that you can't go straight there if you're following the path. So I'm interested in this kind of gathering in, surveying the territory, all these other metaphors versus efficiency. I'm a huge lover of Ursula K. Le Guin's great essay where she says the first human tool might have been the carrier bag that left no trace versus this, the weapons, the spearheads and arrowheads that did, and the stone tools. And then talks about what a narrative is when it's a spear, it's good at jabbing things, moves very fast, might be a story about war and violence and manhood, versus a carrier bag. And she notes that, killing a large animal makes for a very dramatic narrative. It's much harder to tell a story about gathering roots or berries or something. And then she has this great thing, this very kind of wonderfully schoolmarm. She said, I said harder, not impossible. And that's also something I've been interested in getting. I wrote an essay drawing on that, about getting over lone hero narratives and telling stories about collectives, about the beloved community, about social movements, about civil societies, about how change actually happens, which is not from somebody who separates themselves from the community, but somebody who somehow manages to connect and energize and inspire the community. And how do we learn to tell stories with a hunt, in which everybody is a hero? So that's also part of it, and getting over lone hero narratives too.
I love that so much. I love that. And I appreciate it. It just, as a way of thinking, it makes so much, I mean, it just complicates so much. It makes, when you said it's more how we think and talk, I think
Yeah.
that mode of digression, I was just visiting some students on Zoom at a high school, and I was sort of trying to talk about, well, how do we as writers try to listen to a reader? And it feels like, to me, the digression is a kind of mode of listening. You know, there's some way that veering and following stuff that we do not anticipate necessarily is a kind of listening to a reader. It's like actually engaging in a kind of wonder in the presence of someone else, which feels like, you know, asking, are you listening? Are you with me? You know, are you with me?
It's funny because sometimes you're not. I used to go to poetry readings and somebody would say something that was so resonant, my mind would kind of run away. And then like 10 minutes later, I'd be back. And it felt like, I always want to say, it's your fault for being so inspiring. You know, my mind ran away with what you said, you know, and I could still be better disciplined at staying with whatever's going on. But it is that interesting thing. But also I love that you go talk to your best friend, you talk about the state of the world, what's for lunch, where you got those shoes, whatever happened to so-and-so, what are you doing next summer? Let me sew this button on, do you want tea? And there's a funny way, again, just like we sort out what a serious life is supposed to include, and it's not supposed to include flowers, which we haven't talked about nearly enough, you know, but this idea, you know, like definitely it's useful for your news, you know, I was trained as a journalist. It's definitely useful for your newspaper report to stay on topic, but to understand that that's a formal exercise for a particular purpose, but that doesn't have to be how we think and how we connect. And I love those meanders where somebody will go from big public thing. And like my friend Antonia Juhas is like a brilliant oil policy wonk and climate activist and writer. And we'll talk, you know, she's also a girl, and we'll talk about girl things like our personal lives and stuff like, you know, our families. And then we'll go talk about like how to destroy the fossil fuel industry in the next 10 years. And then we'll go back to, you know, like home improvement or something. And like all those things can coexist. And that was one of the things that's also very present in Orwell's work. If you actually look at his domestic diaries, his letters, how he actually lived while he was writing these major things like Animal Farm in 1984 and the political essays.
Yeah. I just want to say one of the beautiful things in this book is when you show up, and one of the times you show up, I think you get off the train or and you're like, I'm just gonna wander around to get where I'm trying to go, you know? And it is this thing of like, you're gonna wander around, and then Tina Madoti shows up, and then Jamaica Kincaid, who I love. I'm so glad to have seen Jamaica Kincaid show up. And then all of these other things show up, which is also the kind of, in terms of the ethics of the meander or the ethics of the digression. Yeah, like it suggests or it understands that there isn't one. There is, even in the idea that there's all these ways of thinking, it is already sort of implying, I think, the collective is a mode of knowing, you know, the sprawling, the wondrous, etc. I have questions here. Let me read one of these questions for you.
Okay.
This is from D.W. Jacobs. Allegra Fuller Snyder, a dance ethnographer, founder of the Center for World Arts and Culture at UCLA, was also the daughter of Bucky Fuller. Recently, in her last years, she'd watched the political marches and protests on TV and began to see them as a form of dance. In the documentary about Dolores Huerta, Dolores says something similar, that she spent her life dancing. Can you comment in light of your thoughts on pleasure politics?
Oh, dances with cops. Yeah. But no, I think that's true. And my younger brother, who I'm going to go do climate strike actions with tomorrow, was one of the people who recognized that protest is performative, it's theatrical. You might as well make it beautiful and visual and tell your story rather than just being like, we don't like what's happening, like in the kind of classic old protest mode. And there's been actually Extinction Rebellion has done literal dances through the streets. There's been so many creative ways to recognize that, first, that moving together is an incredibly powerful way people feel themselves part of a whole. My policy for at least 30 years has been, I love marches, I hate rallies. And the rally, all these people who are active participants just by moving together go back into becoming a passive audience, and usually for bad sound and people telling you more or less what you already know. So yeah, I think dance is an interesting way to think of it. And there's also elaborate ballets when you do like a lockdown and the police are going to remove you, where in some sense, I think some of the really brilliant organizers recognize you're enlisting the police or the security, that there is a choreography to what's going to happen. And, and then the other piece of it is sometimes it is really fun, and sometimes kind of amazing things happen. And it can also be like Occupy Wall Street, which turned 10 last month. It can be a space in which people don't move, they sit still, but have a great inclusive conversation, or, other things happen. I think of the group Reclaim the Streets, which had these giant puppets with jackhammers underneath them, and they planted trees in the middle of a highway that shouldn't have been built, of tree sitters, and the various, and there's now 5 young climate strikers sitting in front of the White House. The many forms of trying to convey one's own conviction, reach the public and politicians, get the message through to win, is a huge retinue of possibilities. And I think it's sometimes thought of as, and there's so much kind of puritanical judgment. Of course, it's theatrical, so you might as well be good at theater, or dance or visuals or puppetry or what, putting jackhammers under giant hoop skirts of people on stilts. So
great. Here's another question, and maybe it overlaps a little bit with the question around digression. And it says, how do you decide how to organize ideas, organize a book? Does this happen organically for you, or is it strategic? If the latter, how?
I'm not sure organic and strategic are that different. I guess, organic might mean that it just magically, it appears unwittingly. And this book, despite being called a collection of essays, is lightly chronological. It introduces Orwell in the first section, and then it goes to the work he did in early 1936, going down into the coal mines before he planted that garden, whose roses I met. If those are actually his roses, there's some doubt now. And, then he went to the Spanish Civil War, which is the next section. And I proceed through to 1984, his last book and his death. So that I knew that I would move through to some extent, but it was really this huge research project that was about getting to know his work better, getting to know the context better. Sometimes, and research is so much fun, and there's lots of detective movies, but not a lot that show that scholarship can be a kind of detective work. And I found a footnote in an academic article that led me to see Orwell had been incredibly excited by the scientist at a freedom of expression conference in London during the war, talking about the repression of scientists and bogus science in the Soviet Union, which led me to the fact that Stalin was obsessed with trying to force lemon trees to grow in environments colder than lemon trees grow in, which became such a wonderful little sort of synecdoche for everything Stalin was doing to everyone, and the kind of brutalism of trying to reinvent humanity, reinvent agriculture, reinvent plants, through sheer kind of violence, aggression, intimidation. He was bullying lemon trees. And fortunately, I think the lemon trees, we're not going to be bullied. But so it's really looking at, and then to talk about Orwell, about the tensions between aesthetics and ethics, for example. I'd known for a very long time that the roses you get sold in supermarkets and Trader Joe's and most florists, 90% of all the roses sold in the US are grown under horrible labor and environmental conditions around Bogota and Colombia, and to a lesser extent, Ecuador. And I had the great good fortune of having a friend who had spent years doing labor organizing in Colombia and knew the industry inside out, my friend Nate Miller, who took me. So there's a section in which we visit to see roses, which are the very symbol of beauty, becoming completely alienated commodities produced through really hideous means ecologically and humanistically. So it's really kind of about what illustrates, what does it mean that Orwell planted roses? Where does that take you? Where does reading about Orwell take me? What are the points that I want to make? Because it let me think about a lot of things that I wanted to think about, like this ethics, aesthetics, tension, like the bread and roses phrase's origin. So it's really, how do we understand this more deeply by bringing these many stories together? So, so I guess it was strategic would be the one word answer I'm almost incapable of.
So though in that mode of research, would you sometimes go chase something down and be like, didn't matter? Or it wasn't, is that part of it?
Yeah, no, there are dead ends and things that don't pan out. There are some things that didn't happen because I thought I might visit the Isle of Jura where he spent his last years. And, and we had a pandemic instead. And the same thing went, I have a friend in India who's going to take me to Motihari, where Orwell was born and where his father was essentially a drug dealer since he was an opium agent. The British government was officially producing opium to force the Chinese to purchase in order to offset the British consumption of Chinese goods, which precipitated two opium wars, a lot of addiction and tragedy, and a lot of brutality towards Indian peasant farmers forced to grow opium and, be dominated by the British. So there are things, and a lot, usually, because I've been doing this a long time, there's not stuff that I don't get that far before I'm like, okay, that person isn't who I thought they were, or I don't have the material, or, that's not well enough documented. There was one tangent, Dorothea Lange's migrant mother photograph was taken the same month Orwell was in the coal mines in the north of England. And the woman herself, who was a farm worker, but who's also a full-blood Cherokee, has this kind of remarkable story. And I kept trying to work her in, partly because I loved Dorothea Lange and Orwell, Lange in California, Orwell in the industrial and mining districts in Britain, both trying to understand poverty and exploitation, and partly because the photograph and the story is so remarkable. And it gets again at something I wanted to do, which is to convey that not everybody who likes plants is a wonderful person, ergo, the Nazi love for forests, Stalin's gardens and lemon trees, but also that not all farm work, as we know so well in California, where we have a huge immigrant labor population doing the farm work and suffering and being exploited. Not all farm work is lovely either. So this woman who was a starving pea picker in a pea picking camp in Southern California as the kind of foil to Orwell, being able to very much, plant a vegetable garden on his own terms. So I finally found a bridge too far.
Yeah. Will that become something else, you think?
I think so. And it might be a standalone essay, just thinking about it. And I've gathered everything written in some of the videos on the photograph and the woman, more or less. Her name is, God, what is it? It's something Thompson. And she actually had many kids, some of whom are visible in the picture, but they settled in California, got by okay, and she lived into old age and was interviewed a few times as an old woman about the photograph, about her life, etc.
Wow.
Okay.
Amazing. Well, I think we are at time. I see the 8:55. Karina, is that correct? One more question. We got to
stop talking to you. We need to check in and we need to hang out.
I know. I kind of feel like this should be a preliminary to a longer thing. Here's a great question, I think. And how do you think people 50 to 80 years from now will narrate the story of what we're going through currently regarding climate change?
I think they will thank and bless those who did everything they could and curse those who didn't. And this is the crucial decade in which we decide whether we choose the best case scenario or let the worst case scenario, or something in between unfold. And I think going, they will know that their fate was decided, in this decade, and it was decided all along in the Industrial Revolution. But we've had 30 years in which we've been conscious of climate chaos and done way too little about it. And we're doing more and more. There are these great graphs in the New York Times showing this is the climate curve of before Paris. This is where we were with Paris. This is the current commitments that haven't been acted on. And this is where we need to be in terms of emissions reductions. And it was really interesting because it's like, yes, we're not where we need to be. Yes, we've literally bent the curve pretty profoundly with Paris and the commitments. Yes, and so as somebody who's very committed to trying to keep people engaged by keeping them hopeful, I keep saying we have not done enough, but we've done a lot. What has already happened matters. We need to step it up. So, yeah, what a great final question if we're out of time.
Yeah.
I always picture myself just following you around one of your gardens saying like, what are you doing? What's that?
It'll happen. It'll happen.
Can I taste that?
Yeah, we have this community orchard out here. You would love.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah. So, but yeah, just to, like in closing, I just want to say again, how much your work means to so much of us. And so I just want to say how grateful, how lucky I feel to have this conversation and how beautiful this book, Orwell's Roses, is, but also how important you are to all of us, all your work. So it's just really grateful.
Well, thank you so much. To be continued.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you so much, Rebecca and Ross, for this conversation. It's been really a gift to spend an hour with you today. And I want to thank our audience out there in cyberspace, and I want to thank Scripps Presents so much for hosting. My name's Maddie Gobo. I am the events manager at Skylight Books. I just want to give you guys all a heads up that we do have some signed book plates, and we have plenty of copies of Orwell's Roses for sale at the store, and we would love for you to order them. You can order on our website, skylightbooks.com. I'm going to go ahead and drop the link in the chat for you all to make it super easy. There it is. And we just want to highlight a couple of upcoming events we have. First off, this Saturday is Skylight's 25th anniversary. We have been in business since 1996, and we wish we could throw a gigantic party with cake and ice cream for everyone, but we cannot. However, we will be having some special merch. We're doing special deals all day long on Saturday, so please come by and say hello to us. You can also get those deals on our website, again, skylightbooks.com. And then next week, we have 3 awesome upcoming in-person events. On November 2nd, we are hosting the launch for Kyle Lucia Wu's Win Me Something. It's a memoir. It's her debut. On the 3rd, November 3rd, we are going to be hosting the great Mary Gateskill at the Philosophical Research Society for her new book, The Devil's Treasure. And then on the 4th, in the store, the Dion's, which is fantastic. Can you guys hear me? Okay, great. So yeah, you can check out those events and more at our website, skylightbooks.com/event. And we would love to see you in the store anytime. We're open every day, 10 a.m. to 10 p.m. All right, I want to say thanks again to Rebecca and Ross. And I'm going to say my goodbyes. Keep reading, everybody, and take care.